In 1982, a brutal and tragic event unfolded in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon, an event that left hundreds, perhaps thousands, dead and cast a long shadow over the region. This massacre is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's an event that still haunts the memories of those who witnessed it. But beyond the historical facts, the massacre is surrounded by fierce controversy, with each side offering radically different interpretations of who bears responsibility and what the massacre represents. In today's video, we'll take a detailed look at the Sabra and Shatila massacre, examining the causes, the key players, and the lasting impact it has had on the Middle East, while also discussing the most extreme perspectives from both sides. To understand the Sabra and Shatila massacre, we first need to look at the broader context of Lebanon's civil war, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. Lebanon was a country divided along sectarian lines. Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Christians, and Druze all had political and military factions vying for control. The Lebanese government was weak, and the war turned Beirut, once known as the Paris of the Middle East, into a battleground. Adding to this complexity was the presence of Palestinian refugees. Many Palestinians had fled to Lebanon after the establishment of Israel in 1948, and the refugee camps, like Sabra and Shatila, were overcrowded and under the control of armed Palestinian factions, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which was a key player in the ongoing conflict with Israel. In June 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon. The stated goal of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, was to push out the PLO and create a security buffer zone along Israel's northern border. However, the Israeli invasion was deeply controversial, both internationally and within Lebanon, as it brought further instability to an already war-torn country. For many Palestinians and their supporters, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was not just a strategic move to push back the PLO. It was seen as part of a broader pattern of aggression aimed at destroying Palestinian resistance, regardless of the civilian cost. Radical voices on this side argue that Israel deliberately created the conditions for the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, knowing that the Phalangists would target Palestinians as revenge for the assassination of Bashir Gemayel. Some even go so far as to say that the massacre was an act of ethnic cleansing aimed at eliminating the Palestinian presence in Lebanon altogether. These opinions focus on the belief that Israel's involvement in Lebanon was less about defense and more about expanding control over Palestinian territories and reducing the Palestinian population's influence in the region. From this perspective, the massacre was a cold calculation by Israeli leadership, with the Phalangist militia acting as a proxy for the IDF. One of the major battles during the Israeli invasion was the siege of Beirut. Israeli forces surrounded the city, targeting PLO positions and attempting to drive the group out of Lebanon. For months, Beirut endured heavy bombardment, and the civilian population, including the Palestinian refugees living in Sabra and Shatila, suffered greatly. Eventually, a peace agreement was brokered by the United States. Under the terms of the agreement, the PLO agreed to leave Lebanon, and Yasser Arafat and his fighters were evacuated. However, not all Palestinian fighters left, and many women, children, and elderly Palestinians remained behind in the refugee camps. But with the PLO gone, a dangerous power vacuum was left in Beirut, particularly in the Palestinian refugee camps. The Lebanese Christian Phalangist militia, who were allied with Israel, saw an opportunity to strike at what they saw as the remnants of the Palestinian fighters. From the perspective of radical pro-Israeli voices, the events leading up to the massacre at Sabra and Shatila were the result of Palestinian militant actions and the long-standing threat the PLO posed to Israel. In this view, the responsibility for the chaos in Lebanon and the eventual massacre lies squarely on the shoulders of the PLO and its supporters, who, according to these voices, used refugee camps as bases for launching attacks against Israel. Radical elements in this camp argue that the IDF's presence in Lebanon was a necessary measure to protect Israel from further incursions by Palestinian militants. They view the Phalangists' actions as a result of years of provocation by the PLO framing the massacre not as a cold-blooded act of revenge, but as an unfortunate consequence of the civil war's brutal nature. These voices tend to downplay Israel's role, asserting that the blame lies primarily with the Palestinian leadership for failing to protect its own civilians and with the Lebanese militias who carried out the massacre. One of the key figures during this period was Bachir Gemayel, the leader of the Lebanese Phalangist militia and the newly elected president of Lebanon. Gemayel was seen as a rising star by many in the Christian community, and he had strong support from Israel, which viewed him as a potential ally in the region. But on September 14, 1982, just days before he was set to take office, Gemayel was assassinated in a bombing at the Phalangist headquarters in East Beirut. The assassination sent shockwaves through Lebanon, and the Phalangists were quick to blame Palestinian factions for the attack, though it was later revealed that a pro-Syrian group was likely responsible. In the immediate aftermath of Gemayel's death, the Phalangists sought revenge, and their focus turned to the Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut, particularly Sabra and Shatila. On September 16, 1982, 2 days after Gemayel's assassination, the Israeli Defense Forces surrounded the Sabra and Shatila camps, blocking all entrances and exits. While the IDF did not directly participate in the massacre, they allowed the Phalangist militia to enter the camps, ostensibly to clear out any remaining PLO fighters. What followed was one of the most horrific atrocities of the Lebanese Civil War. Over the next 2 days, Phalangist militiamen went from house to house, rounding up Palestinian civilians, men, women, and children, and killing them in cold blood. Entire families were massacred, and bodies were left strewn across the streets and alleys of the camps. Radical pro-Palestinian voices take the argument a step further, accusing Israel not just of complicity but of direct responsibility for the massacre. According to these critics, the Israeli Defense Forces knowingly allowed the Phalangists to enter the camps, fully aware that they would target Palestinian civilians. Some even claim that Israeli forces provided logistical support or at least turned a blind eye to the massacre as it unfolded. This view sees the massacre as an extension of Israeli policies aimed at weakening Palestinian resistance and views the actions or inaction of the Israeli military as a war crime. Reports vary on the exact number of people killed, but estimates range from 800 to over 3,500, with many of the victims being civilians. Survivors later recounted scenes of unimaginable horror, with mass graves being dug to dispose of the bodies. While the massacre was carried out by the Phalangists, the role of the Israeli military has been a subject of intense debate and condemnation. Israeli forces maintained a perimeter around the camps and had control over the area, but they did nothing to stop the killings. In fact, Israeli flares were used to light up the night sky, making it easier for the Phalangists to continue their brutal campaign after dark. News of the massacre shocked the international community. Journalists who entered the camps in the days following the massacre reported on the scenes of devastation, and the images of the slaughtered civilians quickly spread across the globe. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session, and the massacre was widely condemned as a war crime. Radical voices across the globe, particularly in pro-Palestinian activist circles, have labeled the Sabra and Shatila massacre as an act of genocide, demanding that Israel be held accountable. Many have called for international tribunals to prosecute Israeli leaders for war crimes, claiming that the massacre was a deliberate attempt to destroy the Palestinian people in Lebanon. These voices argue that the lack of meaningful international action following the massacre has contributed to a broader culture of impunity when it comes to Israeli policies in the region. The Kahan Commission was tasked with investigating the role of the Israeli government and military in the massacre. After months of investigation, the commission found that while Israeli forces were not directly responsible for the killings, they bore indirect responsibility for failing to prevent the massacre. The report specifically blamed Defense Minister Ariel Sharon for allowing the Phalangists to enter the camps and for not taking sufficient steps to protect the civilians inside. As a result of the commission's findings, Sharon was forced to resign as defense minister, though he continued to hold various political positions in the years that followed, eventually becoming prime minister. The Commission's conclusions were seen by many as a partial vindication, but for the survivors of Sabra and Shatila, justice remained elusive. Radical pro-Israeli voices argue that the Kahan Commission's findings were unjustly harsh on Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Defense Forces. In their view, Sharon and the IDF had no way of knowing that the Phalangists would carry out a massacre, and the IDF's primary concern was removing the PLO threat from Lebanon. These voices often emphasize that the Phalangists, not the IDF, were responsible for the killings, and they claim that Sharon was made a scapegoat for the tragedy. In this narrative, Sharon is seen as a patriot who acted in Israel's best interest under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The massacre at Sabra and Shatila had profound and lasting consequences for the region. For the Palestinian people, it became yet another symbol of their ongoing struggle for justice and recognition. The event further fueled anti-Israeli sentiment in Lebanon and across the Arab world, intensifying the already volatile dynamics of the Middle East. Sabra and Shatila also had a significant impact on international perceptions of Israel and its role in the region. While the massacre did not fundamentally alter the course of the Lebanese civil war, it contributed to the deepening divisions between Israel and its neighbors and complicated the already fragile peace process. The Sabra and Shatila massacre remains one of the most horrific episodes in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a reminder of the devastating human cost of war and the lasting wounds that such atrocities leave behind. As we've seen, the event is surrounded by heated debate and radical opinions that continue to shape the narrative of what happened in September 1982. For the survivors, the massacre is not just a historical event. It is a living memory of loss, pain, and injustice. And for the world, it serves as a powerful lesson about the dangers of hatred, revenge, and unchecked violence in times of war. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Sabra and Shatila massacre. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Let us know what other topics you'd like us to explore in future videos,